Okay, I'm very happy today to introduce to you Susan Evans McClure. She is the executive director of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. And she was formerly the director of programs and audience development at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. And she focused on the importance of humanities to civic life. She has her master's degree in arts and education and her BA in theater and history from McGill. The master's degree is from Harvard, I believe. So she's got a lot of qualifications, and we're very excited to have her here. We have a lot of people who are interested in Vermont history. So I guess I will turn it over to you, Susan.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Peggy, for having me. And nice to see so many people on this day. We're hoping it stays snow up here. The Maritime Museum is outside of Virgins, but I'm actually your neighbor in Heinsberg. So I'm looking at snow out my window. We'll hope for it to stay. Let me just figure out how to do my screen here, share my screen. Okay. So now I can't see you, but I can see my screen. So can someone just say if they can see it or not?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great.
Yes, it's fine. Thanks.
So I'll kind of go through things, but I think I can no longer see you. So if you do have questions, you're welcome to jump in. I won't see you raise your hand, so just kind of say something, or we can do questions at the end for sure too. So thank you so much, everyone, for having me. We'll talk about these. Okay, thank you for having me today. I'm going to talk about Prohibition in the Champlain Valley. And when you think about Prohibition, most people imagine gangsters and bootleggers with Tommy guns and fancy cars in the 1920s. But to truly understand the federal Prohibition era in the Champlain Valley, you have to start way earlier than the ratification of the 18th Amendment in 1919. Vermont actually had statewide prohibition from 1853 to 1903. We hold the record for the longest statewide prohibition of any state in the country. So this afternoon, we'll just take a look at how the Champlain Valley went from being a huge producer and consumer of alcohol in the early 1800s to a hotbed of temperance sentiment by the mid-19th century. And we'll look at what all of this can tell us about the tensions between regulation and personal freedom that are continuing to play out in our society today. So this woman here is one of my favorite pictures. We got this from the Vermont Historical Society. And I should jump in here and say that while we are talking about Prohibition in the Champlain Valley, and we will talk about the lake, that I am the director of Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. And we're a museum dedicated to understanding our past so that the past of Lake Champlain and our region, so that we can build together in the present and then create a sustainable future for our lake and for our communities and for all of us. So we're open to the public from May to October every year. In the winter, we do programs with students. So we do boat building programs and school programs. And we're also home to a team of underwater archaeologists who are studying the amazing history that exists underneath the water in Lake Champlain. So I hope you will mark your calendars to come visit us when we open in the end of May this year. And until then, thank you so much for joining for conversations like this. And we have lots more on our website about our local Vermont and New York and Lake Champlain history. So back to Prohibition and back to my favorite century. Actually, we're going to start at the end of the 18th, but the early 19th. Anyway, there she is. This is an image from the Vermont Historical Society. We don't know much about it. Kind of her outfit probably tells us it's like early 1900s, maybe 1910s. And I just love her. I just think she's so fun. And right, she's in a boat. We don't know where she is, but could be anywhere. So we'll go back to this tavern sign from the early 1800s. This one is from the Smithsonian collection, so not from Vermont. It's most likely from the Mid-Atlantic, but it's just such a great example of an early 1800s tavern sign, which is so long ago. So the most comprehensive, and please interrupt me again if anything comes up. I can't see you. I just see the pictures, and I hope you're seeing them too. So the most comprehensive survey of colonial era drinking was done by a historian named W.J. Rorabaugh in the early 1970s. And what he did was he carefully analyzed production records and tax records to reveal that American drinking peaked in 1830 when, hold on to your hats here, per capita consumption. So per capita, every person, consumption of distilled liquor reached 5 gallons per year. That's every single man, woman, and child consuming 5 gallons of just spirits, so just hard liquor annually. Now, assuming that men were doing about 2/3 of the drinking, that works out to be about 4 to 5 shots of alcohol per day, every day of the year. And that was just the booze. Rorabaugh also estimated that the annual per capita consumption of hard cider was 15 or more gallons per year. Vermont's own Ethan Allen was well known for a hearty cocktail itself. It was called the Stone Fence, where he actually just took rum and hard cider and mixed them together. So these two drinks, very popular drinks of whiskey and cider, were really the mainstays of American drinking. But why whiskey and cider? So in the early so apple trees, especially in an area like this, were really everywhere. And hard cider basically made itself in this region. It's not accidental that apple trees were everywhere. And actually it was kind of a chicken and egg. So the popularity of cider meant that people were planting more apple trees meant for cider. Apples are actually not native to North America. That's a whole other presentation on the history of apples and cider, but an interesting aside. But in this region, especially, apple trees were everywhere. Hard cider basically made itself, right? You pressed your cider, leave the barrel, it fermented a little bit. It wasn't super strong. But distilling your corn or grain, if you were a farmer, was actually a more efficient way to transport it to market. If you lived in a rural area like this part of Vermont and New England, you would grow corn and grain, but it would actually rot before you could get it to the place where you were going to sell it. So if you distilled it where you grew it, it had more value and it never went bad. And whiskey itself actually became a barter currency in this early Republic era. So the early Republic is from the founding of the country, 1776 up to kind of the 1820s. Each state during that time period had its own currency, and often it was completely unregulated and had no value. It was worthless. So whiskey became what you needed to buy or sell, what you used to buy or sell what you needed. Whiskey was often cheaper than coffee and tea, and in a pre-Louis Pasteur era of understanding pasteurization, it was safer to drink than water and milk. So in historian Adam Kurkowski's research for his book on Prohibition in Vermont, he noted that by 1820, there were 200 distilleries operating in Vermont. Every town and area had a local distillery. Some towns had more than one. And in his book, Kurkowski did a great job demonstrating just how prevalent distilling was across the state. He wrote of an 1811 article in the Bennington Reporter that reported on a fire in Peacham, Vermont. So the newspaper article said, quote, "On Sunday evening, the gin distillery of Mr. Ephraim Foster of Peacham, with its valuable contents, was destroyed by fire. It may not be improper to observe that 27 stills yet remain in operation in the single town of Peacham. If not with milk and honey, certainly this land o'erflows with gin and whiskey." However, this easy access and mass consumption of alcohol, it was causing real societal harm by the 1830s. Violence against women, husbands deserting their families or spending all the family's money on alcohol were common occurrences. Alcohol was cheap, it was everywhere, it was part of society, and it was causing real problems by the 1830s. So even though there was lots of drinking in the early Republic era, and I can't understate that enough, there has always been this thread of temperance and prohibition in American society. As early as the late 1700s, prominent physicians were speaking out on the ill effects of liquor on the spirit and morality. A physician and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Rush, published a pamphlet in 1797 that was called An Inquiry into the Effects of Spirituous Liquors on the Human Body. And you can see it on there, it says, "To which is added a moral and physical thermometer." So his moral and physical thermometer is on the right there. I'm gonna go to the next page where we'll be able to see it from a later printing, but get a better view of it. So you can see that the Rush thermometer measures intemperance, the drinking of strong drink at the bottom, equating that to health issues, to temperance, the drinking of water and milk at the top, equating that with health and moral character. So the worst thing you could do was to drink rum with pepper in it, because it would lead to vices, diseases, and punishments, such as debt, black eyes, hunger, hospitalization, jail. But as you kind of moved up your moral and physical thermometer, drinking wine, cider, and then small beer, which was actually just a very low alcohol style beer, heading up to water and milk and water, you got into the temperance side of health, where you had health and wealth, cheerfulness, strength, and generally your life was better. I love this image and I love this thermometer. And I love the popularity of this pamphlet, because it kind of suggests that this idea of drinking and health were really connected to each other. And as the field of medicine was changing in the early 1800s, physicians continued to work on this link between drinking and health. And in fact, during Montreal's 1832 cholera epidemic, it was noted that several members of Montreal's 3 temperance unions largely escaped the sickness that actually killed many of the immigrants and immigrant populations of Montreal. Physicians saw this and used it as evidence that not drinking could protect against ill health and disease. Of course, many of the members of the temperance societies in Montreal in 1832 were wealthier and had access to sanitation and clean water, but the link that the doctors made was to drinking alcohol, and it was presented as a health issue. So the United States actually sent physicians to Montreal to study the cholera epidemic in 1832. And when cholera arrived in New York City in the 1840s, they produced signs like this one that you're looking at now that counseled people to be temperate in eating and drinking. Abstain from cold water, not sure what that one was. And above all, abstain from ardent spirits. And that was suggesting that you should stop drinking to prevent cholera, which of course we now know in a germ theory world that we live in now that that's not what it was about, but that was what medical professionals were telling you at the time. In terms of asides, there's also an interesting story about the cholera epidemic moving on Lake Champlain. You can always find a lake angle. Moving on Lake Champlain, steamboats actually from Montreal all the way down to New York City. Again, topic for another time. But speaking of boats, I spent a lot of time in this project when we started it in 2020, really wondering how Prohibition became legal in Vermont and popular in New York on the other side of the lake by the mid-19th century, when people actually started the 19th century drinking so much. So in doing this research, I've come to believe that it was a convergence of 3 major societal factors in our region that all happened at the same time as this absolute peak of American drinking that opened the door for mid-19th century temperance. So the 3 big factors that created the mid-19th century temperance movement, we'll talk about each of them, but the first was really dramatic changes in transportation that led to a new rural and urban divide. The second, it was an increase in religiosity or religious fervor. And the third was racist fears about new immigrants arriving in North America. So the one we'll tackle first is transportation and urbanization. So this image is actually is of canal boats heading down Lake Champlain to the Champlain Canal from the late, I think this photo's from the late 19th century actually. But when the Erie and the Champlain Canals opened in the 1820s, they changed everything in our region. So in terms of making whiskey, what happened was that distilling went from being a local activity to a regional one, as larger distilleries in Western Pennsylvania and Western New York began distributing whiskey on the canal system. So after the canals opened, farmers in the Champlain Valley could now transport their perishable goods much more easily and quickly. So they actually weren't forced to distill them. They could ship them to major markets in New York City and Albany. And the larger distilleries started making whiskey in Western Pennsylvania and Western New York that actually was the whiskey of the whole nation. So in the early 1800s, when the temperance activists came to farmers and said, you should really stop drinking, it was really easy for the farmers to say, no way, the distilleries are our whole lives. They keep our products, they help our products not rot, and then we can sell them, we use them to barter with. But then as the canal started opening and the distilleries started closing, when your neighbor said, you should really stop drinking. It was actually a lot easier to say, hey, you know what? You might be right. My whole life is not based on this anymore. Let's consider it. The canal system also increased urbanization in the Champlain Valley, creating manufacturing and urban centers on both the New York and Vermont sides of the lake. Historian Paul Searles argued that it was at this point in time that there started to develop two Vermonts, a rural Vermont based in an agrarian lifestyle that he referred to as uphill, and an urban Vermont with manufacturing and city infrastructure that he referred to as downhill. And alcohol was really seen as an urban problem. The rural-urban divide was happening across the country at this time in the start of the 19th century, but in a region whose geographic features reinforced its urban-rural divide, that break was even more pronounced as the 19th century moved forward. So along with changes to the economy and the creation of a rural and urban divide, you also see a large increase in religious activity, particularly in New England and rural upstate New York at this time in the mid-19th century. It was called the Second Great Awakening, and it was a Protestant religious revival that was characterized by large conversion events where large groups of people would gather in a town center, sometimes under a tent. See the tents here, a tent revival, they were sometimes called. And traveling preachers would come to rural areas and preach the gospel. Temperance was almost always tied to these religious messages. And early Vermont was characterized by a lack of morality in the eyes of the surrounding states. Famous political characters like Ethan Allen were seen as hard-drinking religious dissidents. Missionaries from Connecticut and Massachusetts and New York actually came into Vermont specifically to reform Vermont in the early 1800s, and they brought with them a focus on temperance. And now, along with religious fervor and changes in the economy, 19th century America was facing a new influx of immigrants. Vermont and New York were both seeing these changes, especially in groups of working class immigrants that were part of the new economic system, like Irish immigrants who were building the Champlain and Erie canals, and the Italian immigrants who were working in various granite quarries, and the French Canadian immigrants who were working in the mills of northern Vermont and Winooski area. Often the Irish immigrants, pictured here in this 1840s sheet music song that was called The Lament of the Irish Immigrant, often the Irish immigrants working on the canals were paid in whiskey, and they were mainly single young men who worked really hard in horrible conditions, barely made any money, and drank a lot. And while certainly many canal workers were hard drinking, the anti-Irish sentiment of the area stemmed from Irish caricatures and anti-Catholicism at the same time. So while there were a lot of newspaper stories about pretty much drunk canal diggers who got into trouble along the canal systems, I think it's important to look back on those 19th century newspaper articles and really wonder, it's hard to tell how many, it definitely happened. It's hard to tell how much it happened versus how much people were paying attention to it, because there was already an anti-Catholic sentiment of the area and a suspicion around that kind of pushed journalists towards kind of covering it a little bit more. So in 2006, in the Vermont History Journal, Vincent Edward Feeney quoted from a tavern keeper who worked in upstate New York near Lake Champlain in the mid-1800s. And this tavern keeper said of the Irish, "They will soon have 5 to 1 against us. They are very noisy people when they drink. They hitherto received from the Canadian government 5 pounds with some rations, each family, as an encouragement to settle and clear the forest. When the allowance is consumed, they almost invariably slip over into the United States. There is no stability in their loyalty to our government." Now, that language of loyalty to government, especially in immigrant groups, comes up again and again in attacks on immigrants of the time. And unfortunately, that language is still something that you can see all too often in our society today. So temperance crusaders in the mid-19th century used really any means necessary to attract attention and sway hearts and minds, most notably through songs and circulars. And I think it's pretty easy to say that 19th century temperance was a bit of a dour movement, right? It often is very frequently attached to anti-immigrant sentiment. It doesn't really seem very fun, but actually it was very social. It was really temperance societies bringing people together. We'll talk in a minute about women's temperance societies, but there were a lot of songs about temperance and popular music in the 19th century was often shared through sheet music. Entertainment was in the home. Many people played pianos, and they would gather in the parlor and sing these temperance songs. So the Green Mountain Yankee, a temperance medley, was printed in 1852. This is from the Library of Congress sheet music collection. And it recounts the tale of a Vermonter who visits Boston, meets members of a temperance society, and signs a temperance pledge. And he sings, "I'm right from the mountain, just from Vermont. My visit to Boston I now recount. Some notion of trade was my intention, and I went to look at the great convention," probably a temperance convention. "And when I got there, I did declare, the whole community at me did stare, just because I was from Vermont." And the song ends with a really rousing chorus that's really fun. And you can see it here. I'm not sure if this is going to work because I can't see you, but I'm going to sing it for you. And then I would encourage you to all come off mute and we can try to sing it together and just kind of see what happens if you're up for it. So the song ends with a really upbeat chorus that goes, "Oh, that would be joyful, joyful, joyful. Oh, that would be joyful when mankind drink no more." So again, I'm just looking at a screen now, so I have no idea if anyone is going to do this. But if you want to, we can start in 1, 2, 1, 2. Oh, that would be joyful, joyful, joyful. Oh, that would be joyful. Men can drink no more. That was lovely. Thank you. And that's the idea with these temperance sing-alongs, right? It's not about sounding perfect. It's about getting that message in your head while just doing it with other people. And it was kind of a fun way to do it. Thank you for being game to do that. So by 1832, there were around 200 temperance society clubs in Vermont alone. And temperance societies actually became a new social area in which women could flex their political muscles. These hardy ladies that you're looking at here are the Western Vermont chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1884. The temperance movement was really characterized by strong connections to proper notions of family and women, and it was often a women-led movement. Freedom from alcohol and abusive or neglectful men were major themes. And this early maternal feminist movement argued that intemperance was a threat to the Christian home. And you can really trace an evolution towards prohibition as a facet of suffrage and the wider women's movements in the 20th century. So in 1888, these women were probably involved in it. The Women's Christian Temperance Union of Vermont passed a series of what they called resolutions relating to women's rights, temperance, and other reforms. And in their resolutions, the lines are really blurred between temperance as the main issue and all sorts of other issues that relate to the well-being of women. They actually talk about universal childcare. They talk about access to education for children. And all of those ideas are voting. They talk about voting. All of those ideas are connected to this central core of temperance. And in some ways, studying the temperance movement of the 19th century demonstrates that you can kind of see temperance as this little nucleus around which kind of all the other political movements are rotating and spinning. Many temperance groups linked temperance to all sorts of issues, including the abolition of slavery, which is something that another side topic that is fascinating, not totally the focus today, but there is a strong link between abolition societies, specifically ones led by white Christian women, and temperance societies. So temperance in the 19th century really starts as a local and community effort and morphs into this national issue, getting linked to all sorts of other political issues along the way. And around the country, women-led temperance groups start advocating for suffrage, making the case that women need the right to vote so that they can vote for temperance and protect the morals of our nation. And a cooperative effort between the Vermont Women's Suffrage Association and the Women's Christian Temperance Union actually succeeded in granting tax-paying women the right to vote in municipal elections in the 1880s. So I just have to clarify there, yes, some women, a very small amount of women who owned land and paid taxes could vote in municipal elections in Vermont in the late 1880s. And they linked that very strongly to the need for temperance so that they could vote to keep Vermont dry. So all of these efforts were working in the mid-19th century. If the goal was to decrease alcohol consumption from that kind of zany peak of the 1820s, it totally worked. Across the country, alcohol consumption dropped by about half from 1825 to 1850. So in 1851, Maine actually became the very first state to enact statewide legislation prohibiting the manufacture and traffic in intoxicating liquor, as they said. Vermont came in a close second, passing statewide prohibition in 1853, and like I mentioned, holding the record for the longest statewide prohibition for 50 years. So before 1853, Vermont had the local option in which each town voted, often annually, on whether or not they would issue liquor licenses for that year. And then after the referendum passed, they had full statewide prohibition to outlaw the sale of spirituous beverages in 1853. And what happened in 1853 was that the referendum passed mainly with the support from Vermont's rural communities. So some of those rural and urban themes that we talked about earlier at the beginning. This sign here is from the Bennington Museum. They're not totally sure when it's from, but it points travelers to the wet town of Granville, New York, the dry town of Paulette, Vermont, and the damp town of Wells, right on the border. Just love that idea of being damp. So under Vermont's law, it was prohibited to sell alcohol, but you could make it for your own consumption as long as it was not sold or given to a habitual drunkard or led to anyone's intoxication. So you could have it and you could make it, but you couldn't buy it or you couldn't sell it. And some of these topics around legalization of alcohol in the 19th century, not only do they echo when we talk about legalization of cannabis in the 21st century, but they're almost exactly the same. They really parallel each other. But what actually happened in the 19th century, not to get too current, but what happened in the 19th century is that these really opaque laws created all sorts of interesting cases, court cases, that tested the limits of the law. So in the 1880s, a merchant in Whitehall, New York, at the bottom of Lake Champlain, he ran a mail order business for alcohol. New York did not prohibit the sale of alcohol in the 19th century. So he ran a mail order business for alcohol in which Vermonters would put their jugs on the train in Rutland. The train would carry the empty jugs to Whitehall. The shopkeeper would fill the jugs in Whitehall and put the jugs back on the train. Well, people would leave money on the jug. He'd fill the jug, put it back on the train, and it would go back to Rutland. The Vermonters would pick up their full jugs in Rutland. Vermont issued a warrant for his arrest, but New York wouldn't enforce the warrant. He ended up spending a bit of time in jail, and the case actually goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's one of the cases that is used as an impetus for a federal prohibition law in the 20th century. It was often known as the jug case, and it had a pretty, this is not one of those jugs, this is a jug from a canal boat that is in our collection at the museum that we found at the bottom of the lake. There was also a lot of confusion about what was a spirituous beverage, which was what the law said. It outlawed spirituous beverages. The introduction of German lager beer into Vermont prompted a great case that was called the State of Vermont versus one keg of lager beer. So the beer itself was put on trial to determine whether or not it was intoxicating. It was not a real trial, but it was tried by real attorneys, and it was an actual judge who was judging it, but it wasn't an official Vermont court case, but they put all the works in. So they ultimately found, through highly questionable witness and expert testimony, that the keg of beer was exonerated. It was not found to be intoxicating. And they actually replayed this kind of fake trial several times. But the loophole in Vermont's 1853 liquor law that allowed for production, oh, sorry, let me go back before I get to that. So what you're looking at here is it's actually a label for a lager beer from I think this was one from the Smithsonian collection. Again, there were, lager was something that was introduced by German immigrants. There was, again, some anti-immigrant German sentiment around that, but lager was often seen as it's a lower alcohol beer. So it maybe wasn't as bad as things like whiskey or rum or something like that. So the loophole in the 1853 liquor law allowed people to make it for their personal consumption. But this continued to create stark differences between the rural regions. Really, rural areas in Vermont in the late 19th century, they wouldn't have really noticed a difference. They could still make alcohol for themselves. They could still make cider. But it was urban spaces where alcohol could no longer be bought or sold that really changed how alcohol was consumed and sold. And the most problematic part of the law was how unevenly it was enforced and how it really encouraged corruption within the entire system. A spectacular case was of Catherine Dillon, an Irish immigrant in St. Albans who was a notorious offender. She was arrested and indicted countless times for selling alcohol, but apparently never punished harshly enough to deter her. And she actually became a newspaper sensation in the 1850s and the 1860s. She somehow consistently made enough money to pay all of her fines, which was kind of an interesting clue to the state of prohibition enforcement at the time. And in 1871, the Burlington Free Press wrote, quote, Catherine had a well-developed relationship with those responsible for enforcing the laws, and she benefited from their assistance. So enforcement was also often tied to race and class. Immigrants faced far more prohibition enforcement, specifically in urban centers of Burlington and Barrie, than you did in rural Vermont. And it really becomes often women and immigrant women who were targeted and arrested and fined for breaking the liquor law. So 50 years in, how does the law get repealed? Well, what happens at the very beginning of the 20th century, so the early 1900s era, public sentiment in Vermont doesn't really switch to being anti-temperance or pro-drinking, as it does kind of switch to the government telling you what to do. So one of the challengers for governor in 1902 was Percival Clement. He's pictured here. He doesn't actually win in 1902. He does become governor later. But he makes a strong case that actually turns the tide on statewide prohibition. He gave a speech that became quite popular in Bethel in 1902, where he laid out temperance as an individual issue. So he said, the prohibitionist, while he is not always able to control himself, even in the matter of drinking intoxicating liquors, seeks to control his neighbor, not by precept and example, but by argument and moral suasion. That process is too slow to suit his ideas of progress. And besides, sometimes his neighbor tells him to mind his own business. But the prohibitionist seems to think it is his business to attend to that of his neighbor. So Vermont has another statewide referendum excuse me, in 1903 to decide if they should continue having statewide prohibition. And when the votes are cast, it's the big towns, so Burlington, Montpelier, Rutland, St. Albans, Barrie, Bennington, they cast the majority of votes in favor of returning to the local option. But the majority of rural towns voted to keep prohibition, but the population centers by that time had so many more people that they were able to have fewer towns vote to go back to the local option, but more people living in those towns. In fact, only 83 of Vermont's 246 towns voted to repeal, but that accounted for more total votes. And interestingly, when the anti-prohibitionist champion Percival Clement did become governor in 1918, he actually refused. So when the 19th Amendment passed, which gave women the right to vote federally, Vermont was set up to ratify the amendment. We could have been the last state to ratify the amendment before it passed. But Percival Clement, who was governor at the time, refused to call the legislature back into action to ratify the amendment because he was so afraid that if women got the right to vote, they would vote to bring back prohibition federally, which they didn't vote for, but it did happen. So he passed on the opportunity for Vermont to be the deciding state on the amendment. Vermont did pass the 19th Amendment, but we could have done it in a more timely fashion. So this is about prohibition in the Champlain Valley, right? Both New York and Vermont. So Vermont had this statewide prohibition, but what was happening in New York? Well, the reality is in a large state like New York, with many huge cities and urban centers, they really were never going to pass statewide prohibition. But that's not to say that temperance wasn't popular in New York, specifically in the counties bordering Lake Champlain. The rural spaces themselves came to represent purity and cleanliness and temperance in the 1800s. So a man named Verplanck Colvin, got a great name, he surveyed the Adirondacks in the 1870s. He credited the success of his survey to the temperance policies on his expeditions. He said that the pure waters of the mountains were all his men needed for moral and scientific success. Not a particle of alcohol or fermented liquor of any kind was used, carried, or permitted to be used. The result, he said, has been subordination, steady work, health, and success. So there was a lot of debate at the State House in Albany and a lot of support for prohibition, especially in rural New York, but they really never have any traction for a statewide prohibition law. So the debates about prohibition continue into the 20th century, but it takes until 1919 for federal prohibition to take effect with the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. And what it did was prohibit the, quote, manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. And actually, New York, excuse me, is the 44th state, and Vermont is the 43rd to even ratify the amendment. It only takes 38 states to ratify an amendment. So even in the two states that had this really strong history of temperance, they really don't come out of the gate swinging when it comes to the federal era of prohibition. And this map is actually part of the Cornell University Library. So what happens with federal prohibition in 1919 is that all control is taken away from state and local governments and concentrated with the federal government. And in fact, by the end of the 1920s, the entire state of New York just said they'd stopped enforcing prohibition altogether, and they handed over total enforcement in New York to federal officers. But in a border region like New York and Vermont and Lake Champlain, this affected us a little bit differently than it would kind of a more inland state. What happened was a pretty substantial turn to lawlessness. Smuggling has really always been a way of life for border regions, but during Prohibition, it really reaches a new high. And the most important difference for this region during federal prohibition versus localized prohibition of the 19th century was the impact of out-of-state influences, mainly crime networks from nearby New York and Massachusetts that used our border with Canada to their advantage. So plenty of locals in our area profited in some way, but it was the major organized crime networks from these larger cities that were leading the smuggling schemes and really making all the money. So in a border region like the Champlain Valley, people who were interested in drinking legally could just drive across the border to Canada. Stories of border hotels where folks would line up, like this image from Overton Corners in the 1930s, which is now the Rouse's Point border crossing, just show cars lined up to cross the border. And in fact, this increased border traffic leads to like the very idea of a border as we think of it today. There was a need for searching cars, so federal prohibition actually created the border crossings, like this, where we think of it, where you stop, you get your car checked, and you keep going. Before Prohibition, if you cross the border, you just kind of go to the nearest town to check in. But during Prohibition, the United States created these checkpoints that were right on the actual line of the border. But even with the border, lots of cars got through. In a 1980 article for Vermont History Journal, Bradley Sewell, a former customs officer, recounted his tales of trying to enforce prohibition. He said that the Customs Service border patrols were largely unmanned, and they stopped only a minority of the contraband-laden cars, and they did not arrest many people. And of course, with the lake right here, we have that crosses the border. People did smuggle booze from Canada in boats across the lake, but the same customs agent, Bradley Sewell, said that smuggling on the lake was relatively trivial compared with what crossed the border by car, but it did make for some really great stories. Bradley Sewell shared that the story of one of his largest seizures on the Customs Boat Patrol, they captured 9,600 bottles of Canadian ale and beer. We destroyed the cargo, he wrote, by loading it into an old barge, which we towed to the middle of St. Albans Bay, where we smashed the bottles with hammers and axes and dumped them in the water. And you also see a new style of boat that became known as the Champlain rum boat, pictured here. The smugglers would store the goods on the side shelves at the bow of the boat, and if they were stopped, they would just push the booze into the water and claim they were out for a midnight boat trip. But really, most of the smuggling occurred by car along the many winding roads of Vermont and New York. And massive quantities of contraband were confiscated each month. 40,500 bottles were confiscated and destroyed in 1 week in Rouse's Point, New York in 1923. And over 93,000 bottles were dispatched in September of 1924, which would have been around $500,000 worth of alcohol. However, this was likely only a small fraction of the booze that crossed the border. And this picture here is of the town square in Rouse's Point, Town Square Park in downtown Rouse's Point, New York. It just became a giant heap of broken glass and bottles and cases. And the customs agents did that to kind of prove a point about what they were doing. An interesting thing that happened was that all those cars driving north really benefited Quebec financially. And they had impacts on prohibition efforts throughout Canada too. So like the United States, Canada was debating temperance throughout the 19th century, and each province was making its own rules. Drinking was legal in Quebec, and what happened is that hard liquor could be purchased at state-owned dispensaries. So much revenue flowed into Quebec from the American side of the border that the province saw a pretty healthy increase in economic development and used all that money to go towards infrastructure and even schools. American smugglers would drive north across the border. They would stop at every single government liquor store they passed, gathering their allocation of 1 bottle at each one until they were fully stocked for the run south. And by the end of the 1920s, Ontario saw just how much money Quebec was making, and they actually repealed temperance in Ontario so they could get some of that smuggling money themselves. But public opinion on prohibition really soured during this federal era. This region saw an increase in crime and a real rift between federal and local law enforcement. In an oral history interview with the Vermont Historical Society, Merritt Carpenter, a Vermont native who worked for the Lake Champlain Transportation Company, told the interviewer about prohibition. And what he said was, quote, "Everybody knew who was doing it, but they never got caught." He was talking of smuggling in the St. Albans area, and he added, quote, "It was because the fellow who was the sheriff there knew he had to put up a show of looking for these guys, but he still had to live there." So after public opinion turned against prohibition, it officially ended in 1933 with the ratification of the 21st Amendment and taking it out of step. So here's the headline in the Plattsburgh Daily Press from 1933 with a great cartoon of FDR punching pessimism in the face. And with that, control of liquor regulation was returned to the states, and each state instituted its own rules for the production, distribution, and sale of alcoholic beverages. This production, distribution, and sale system is still called the 3-tier system today, and it's the system that we're all under, where you make, sell, and buy alcohol. But home brewing actually remains illegal until the 1970s, where another federal law had to be passed to make it legal again. And there could be an entire other presentation on the long-term effects of prohibition on the production and consumption of alcohol in our region. But we'll suffice it to say that the first brewery after prohibition didn't open in Vermont until the 1980s. Vermont Pub and Brewery was the first brew pub, and then Catamount Brewery is the first production brewery. But today, Vermont has become, of course, the craft beer capital of America. And ongoing changes to state laws have led to an explosion of breweries and distilleries in the Champlain Valley, both in New York and Vermont. And while we might not be able to go back quite to the number of distilleries we had in 1830 with 200 of them in the state of Vermont, we do have a fair number of distilleries in the Champlain Valley, as you can see here. And we do continue to have some of the same debates about local control, personal decisions, and government regulation. And luckily today, we have a few more places now at which we can discuss those issues over a beer. So, let me stop sharing. Okay, great. So I'd be happy, that's the end of the presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions if folks have questions, or would love to hear what you think too, or what it made you think of. Or if you have any personal stories from your family. I always love hearing people whose own families have a connection to Prohibition history too.
I have a question.
Sure.
Were there a lot of running boats running up and down Lake Champlain? or
So
no?
there were some. I
Okay.
always feel like I'm a bit of I'm a history balloon popper, because like those stories are so fun when it definitely happened. There were definitely people smuggling alcohol. Usually if they did it on the lake, they wouldn't go the whole length of Lake Champlain. They would just kind of use it to cross the border.
I see.
And then they would dock somewhere, usually St. Albans area, and then just drive. So it did happen. There was actually a whole customs boat patrol service on Lake Champlain that was based in St. Albans, whose job was to find smuggling on the lake. And it did happen. But the reality is just like so much more was just driven across through the border.
I see. So once they were in their boats, they were pretty safe.
Well, unless they came across the customs boat patrol, who really never, I mean, they were really going from the border, not even as far south as Burlington.
I got it. Okay.
So I think that's kind of why they wanted to, I mean, I would say, get off of the lake, right? Even if you're pretty exposed, if somebody's looking for you.
Right.
And the lake is a lot more, there's a reason there's so many shipwrecks out on the lake, right? It's small but mighty, and it can be quite dangerous. So it's a lot easier to just fill up the trunk of your car, your giant 1930s car, with cases of alcohol and drive than it is to figure out how to boat on Lake Champlain in the dark, in bad weather and storms, all that stuff. So it did happen, but it was not common.
Interesting. I had read something, I think it was a story in 7 Days about some very enterprising Vermont rum runners on the border who would run their horses back and forth across the border, riderless. And they didn't catch on for so long. I mean, but it worked. But it worked.
It did. And another story I didn't actually talk about, but it's in our, and I should say there's an online exhibit on our website of all of this too, and a lot more if you're interested in it. Another thing that we talk about in our online exhibit are border hotels, which would actually be buildings that are built half in Vermont and half in Canada. And one of the most famous of these, I don't forget her name, was I think it was in Richford, Vermont, but her name was Queen Lil. She was known as Queen Lil, and it was a brothel and a bar, and half of it was in Vermont and half of it was in Canada. So when there was a raid from the federal officers would raid the Vermont side, people would just go to Canada, walk to the other side of the building where they couldn't be arrested. And then if the Canadians were raiding, they would just walk to the Vermont side. She only got arrested twice, and they did a combined Vermont and New York, or Vermont and Canadian raid on the building. But she does just pay her fine really quickly, because, it's kind of what the Merritt Carpenter said in his oral history interview. People still had to live there. Like, these were their neighbors. And that you see that a lot in the stories of rural prohibition, that it's really hard to enforce a federal law that doesn't really apply to you, right? Like, you don't want to enforce a federal law on your neighbor when you maybe don't think it's right. What I did work on the majority of this project during kind of peak COVID, which was really interesting because that was the time where we were thinking about state regulations, right? And, so Vermont had pretty strict rules about COVID, like where you could go, quarantine rules, but like New Hampshire, not as much. So what is to prevent you from just driving across the border in New Hampshire and doing whatever you want? Kind of nothing. And that's what they found with 19th century temperance, or 19th century prohibition in Vermont, with the stories like the jug case, or really going to Canada, any of that. You can just cross the state border, and it's really easy to do that. So that's why when they moved to federal prohibition in the 20th century, they looked at state laws like Vermont and they said, look, statewide prohibition doesn't work. We have to have a federal law. But then when they have the federal law, they end up saying, look, federal laws don't work either. You can just cross the international border. It was, I think that's why I like to start with the 19th century temperance and prohibition discussions, because 20th century prohibition, it's really easy to look at it and just say like, oh, that was dumb. Why did we do that? But when you start in the 20th century, it kind of shows more of when you start in the 19th century, it shows more of the push and pull between this idea of local control, state control, federal regulations. And alcohol regulation is just one example of that. There can be, there's a million things that impact our lives every day that local, state, federal agencies don't agree on. And sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not. So I like finding those correlations in history where it can help us just think a bit about how those local, state, and federal processes work now, and how we can make them work differently if we want to in the future.
I think it's interesting how you correlated prohibition and the rules and the regs with the marijuana rules and regs. They're basically the same thing.
Yeah, and actually it came down to, if you're interested in this topic, there's another historian named Adam Krakowski who wrote a great book about 19th century prohibition in Vermont. But he actually looked at some of the records of the tax rates. They were talking about taxing alcohol in the 19th century in Vermont were, and I kid you not, the exact same tax rate that they are taxing cannabis products at. So sometimes it's echoing and sometimes it's just repeating itself. I don't know, maybe like whatever that tax rate was felt like significant enough to deter people or like significant enough to make it worth it.
That's amazing. Wow.
Peggy, did you put a hand up? And great.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay, Deborah. Those are really interesting questions.
Go, Peggy.
And you're muted, Peggy. Oh, sorry, Peggy, you're muted.
I was struck by the women's impact on so many things, and starting with temperance and trying to protect their families and trying to, starting with that, and then all the other, and the fact that they came together. They had these organizations, and they talked together, and they made a political force. I think that's so interesting about the 19th century.
Yeah, and the temperance movement, right? It's often seen as like they were trying to stop. It was just kind of dour, but it wasn't. It was one area in which women could flex that political muscle and kind of get that training and get empowered around that. I think I mentioned the term maternal feminism, which is a 19th century idea that the way that women can have power is as mothers and in a home setting. So the idea was that maybe you don't have the right to vote, but you can tell your husband who to vote for. So maybe you don't have the right to change the laws about prohibition, but you can gather with your friends and convince the men about what to do. I think that's, at the time, that wasn't radical enough. Like looking back on it, it seems kind of like, really? You couldn't just do it yourself? But temperance becomes this kind of training ground. And what you hear these stories about women who ran suffrage or ran temperance societies. And then once you kind of taste it, they couldn't go back. And they said, look, now that we know what it's like to have political agency, we're not going back. Then women take this really large role in World War I too, also. And have a new form of independence that they've really never had before, both in World War I in the battlefields of Europe, but also at home when all of the men are gone. And that also is another step towards that, like, oh, this is how the world could be. We could have agency, we could have power, and not wanting to go back from that really leads to women's suffrage in 1920, which we all benefited from.
This has been really great. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you all. I love talking about this topic. I think it is one that's easy to think about because it is something we just do not every day, but we do sometimes. And I think that's what I worked in food and beverage history for when I worked in DC, that was a lot of my work was around how what we eat and drink helps us understand history. And it just is a really visceral way, right? Like, well, we all eat food. We've all had a glass of wine sometime. So it's a nice way for us to make a personal connection to what ends up being a really interesting, complicated, dynamic, diverse story that tells us bigger things about America.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. On behalf of the community seniors of Huntington, Bolton, and Richmond, we appreciate it, and we love hearing about our history. And we will send you some we'll send a stipend, I guess you call it, to the
That's nice.
Maritime Museum.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. It helps us make all of the things we do possible. And if you're interested in learning more, definitely check out our website where we have a whole digital exhibit about this. And we have an on-site exhibit about this too that will be open when we are open, I think May 20th. I should know that date, but we hope to see you at the museum.
Thank you so
Very
much.
much.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.